The latest issue of the journal Antiquity had what would seem to be at first an oddly titled paper, The Death of a Pterodactyl. The authors, of course, were referring to a fairly well-known Indian pictograph located in Black Dragon Canyon in Utah. The pictograph was argued by many to be an oddly shaped winged creature. Some creationists even argued it was a pterodactyl. Kalek et al., using portable X-ray fluorescence, have contended this claim is an error, and in fact, the alleged pterodactyl pictograph is a composite of 5 different pictographs. Calling the creationists to the carpet, the authors specifically mentioned several by name, including our own fellow Canadian, author Vance Nelson, who had included the pterodactyl interpretation in his beautifully done book, Dire Dragons, which is a gorgeous compilation of dinosaurs in ancient artwork from around the world. Vance is the author of Untold Secrets of Planet Earth series of books, a researcher with both a theology and biology degree, and he joins me now from his home in Alberta. Welcome to the show, Vance.
Good to be here, Ian.
Now, I can tell just by the look in your face, you're totally shocked by this paper, and you're going to strongly disagree with the interpretation presented, aren't you?
Not quite, Ian. It was not a surprise at all. Actually, in May of 2011, I revisited the Black Dragon Canyon site to take a look at the pictographs again for myself. Now, interestingly, when I was at the site, the first edition of my Dire Dragons book was actually on the ocean coming over from China. Now, you might say, well, why did you print in China? We got good printers here in Canada, and I've had some complaints about that. Well, the fact is that almost everybody prints in China, and if you want to compete in the commercial market, you have to print in China. Sorry about that, but it's just the fact. And so my first edition was actually on the ocean coming over from China. And I had taken a look at many different books on rock art. And that had mentioned Black Dragon Canyon. And interestingly, these books were written by secular authors, supposedly experts on rock art of the American Southwest. And up until just before my books were getting ready to be delivered, the consensus from all of the books and literature that I had read was that this particular pictograph was a unified drawing, a unified pictograph made with pigments. Now, I had come across an exception just before my books were getting ready to be delivered, and the exception was a book that I had read suggesting that it was not a unified pictograph. Now, this was unfortunate in timing, and so I decided, well, let me go back and take a look at this. Now, the other interesting thing is I was in communication with Dr. Gary Parker, who is a very well-known creationist, and we were looking at a fairly small image, actually an image that I had taken myself when I was there previously. And Dr. Parker, looking at the image, he said, you know, this looks like not a unified pictograph, you know, one single image made with pigment, but actually several. And so I decided, you know, I need to go back and to check this out. And so I went back May 2011 and a little more skeptical this time. And when I went back, 5 separate images. Now, unfortunately, in 1947, a gentleman had gone there and he had outlined these 5 images with chalk. And that is why when you go now, your eyes sort of draw all of these things together and you see a unified image. And so that was a problem when this gentleman went and he actually wrote a paper. You know, we outlined all of the pictographic artwork there and it looks like a bird, some weird bird. Well, the fact is there are 5 images there that I was able to see without X-ray fluorescence, okay, just with the naked eye. And the one on the far right is a serpentine creature, and you can actually see the forked tongue. You don't need any specialized equipment. At the far left are 2 quadrupeds. The far left one itself is a goat or a sheep. And then there's a supplicating figure sort of in the center, and he's got his arms out, and you can actually see his legs, and you can see his feet. And then there's another one at the far left that's pretty severely eroded, and the pigments are washing down and things like this. And so I mentioned this to a number of members of the creationist community at the time, etc. Then in 2012, Phil Center went and he said, there are 5 individual pictographs. And I had talked with Phil about this. I said, yeah, you're right. I said, some of your images aren't quite accurate there, though, Phil. And then we had this paper come out, and I was a little disturbed that they referenced me for this particular reason. When I put out my book, now, of course, I had been there May 2011, and I find out that, you know what, I was wrong. And this is about integrity, and so my book still hadn't been delivered, and so I was there, I find out, you know what, I was wrong. It's not a pterosaur at all, it's 5 individual figures. And guess what, most of the secular authors were also wrong. It's not a bird, it's not a weird bird, it's not something like Fran Barnes said that looks like a Cretaceous flying reptile. Okay, it's not a unified object, it's 5 separate figures. And so what did I do? I did what someone has to do that has integrity, and I put an erratum sticker on every single book of that first edition that says that the evidence on those pages is an error, and I apologize, and all subsequent editions will no longer have that evidence. Now, when I mailed out every single book, that erratum sticker went on to every single book. Now, the evolutionists that came out in 2012 and said, oh, look, the creationists were wrong, cited me in 2012, Phil Center, for example. And so I sort of emailed them and said, Phil, how come you did that? I didn't stand by that, and I personally emailed you the book. And also this paper as well. And so when Science Magazine interviewed me, I said I wasn't happy that they did that for the simple reason that had they actually got the copy of the 2011 edition, the very first edition, they would have known that I never stood by that evidence. And so I actually appreciated when Science Magazine interviewed me, they actually put it into the article that I never stood by that evidence. And that was many years ago. We've printed many, many books since then in the second edition. And that evidence hasn't been in our books for a very, very long time. And I was basically the first creationist to have gone back and said, no, this isn't correct. This isn't a pterosaur at all. It's 5 individual pictographs that have nothing to do with a unified object, a unified creature, let alone a pterosaur. And so it's actually the creationists that pointed this out long before the evolutionists. And so it's not an embarrassment to the creationist community whatsoever. We were actually pointing this out years before this paper came out this year.
Mm-hmm. And you use that keyword integrity. I like that. And I agree. It was very good of Science Magazine when they did that news report. They actually, I thought they did you justice. They
did, and I actually left a message for the lady that did the interview, because it's a rarity. Mm-hmm. that they treat our interviews fairly, and I basically told her thank you. I appreciated that.
Yes, because frankly, I think Kellick and team, the authors of the antiquity paper, I think they owe you an apology, frankly. But
well, you know, Marvin Rowe and his techniques, and I told her this, and she never really mentioned this in the paper, but Dr. Marvin Rowe and his techniques for authenticating and the different research that they do with ancient artwork, I really believe he's a type of genius. Mm-hmm. And I can't give him the credibility that he really has and really needs in the archaeological community when it comes to rock art. There are a number of different techniques that he's developed over the years, And one of the techniques that's been developed and published in peer-reviewed journals is plasma oxidation. And maybe we'll get to talk about this in a little bit. But Dr. Marvin Rowe, for nearly 2 decades now, has developed a technique known as plasma oxidation, which allows the dating of pigments that have been painted onto rocks without the interference of, for example, calcium carbonate, if that happens to be the matrix upon which the pigments have been painted. Of course, calcium carbonate, you can get a date on calcium carbonate. And you don't want to date the rocks or the matrix, you actually want to date the pigments. And so I really appreciate Dr. Marvin Rowe. I actually talked to him on the phone a number of years ago about the plasma oxidation technique that he developed a number of years ago. And so I expressed, and so I don't write them off, and I don't really need an apology. I think that what was printed in Science magazine brought things up to speed as far as the fact that, I was there before they published the papers, and I came to this conclusion long before they published any of these papers about this. And so we came to our own conclusions that this was not a pterosaur. And so this wasn't sort of them saying, aha, look what we did, we proved you guys wrong. The other point that I made in the interview that was not published is even when we do demonstrate that some of these things are not extinct reptiles such as pterosaurs or marine reptiles or dinosaurs or other extinct reptiles, for every one we demonstrate are not, I can show you another 20 that are, for example, and maybe we'll get to talk about one or two of these later on in the interview, Ian.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, with the whole integrity issue, which I really appreciate that about you, after that paper came out, of course, the antiquity paper, the internet was rife with accusations, even against you, written by the Libenter ignoramus species. That's Latin for willingly ignorant. These guys were spouting off how creationists are deceitful and liars, and some creationists lied and outlined the 5 pictographs in chalk, which made the vague resemblance of a pterodactyl that everyone argued about. And of course, the guy who outlined the pictograph wasn't even a creationist, so far as we know.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, the gentleman that outlined them in 1947, there's no indication whatsoever that he was trying to make evidence for creation. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that he was even a Christian. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But the point is that this had nothing to do with making evidence for creation. We're not that hard up for the evidence. Mm-hmm. The evidence is what it is. It's out there. And so, yeah, interesting.
And of course, this brings up the $1 million question, okay, which you alluded to. Okay, this pictograph is a mistake. We even acknowledge and agree with that. So what about all the other pictographs, carvings, cave art, etc., by the, dozens or hundreds from around the world with which depict dinosaurs? I mean, your Dire Dragons book alone, you documented how many new examples?
Well, in the Dire Dragons book, which was just sort of the tip of the iceberg, mm-hmm. There are 26 examples in Dire Dragons.
And that was just one book.
That's just one book.
No, I love this. Live Science, of course, did an article on the Kellogg paper, and Benjamin Smith, a professor of world rock art, made an interesting and frankly anti-science comment. He said, since Native American art is of spiritual significance and holds significant religious content, images can also depict magical and mythical subject matter, said Smith. Not all animals in Native American art, therefore, need to depict real-world creatures. Some will be supernatural, but none will be dinosaurs. Emphasis in the original article. Now, this is an interesting comment for several reasons. Most notably, he has put forward his scientific conclusions before he even examined the evidence. That's anti-science. Now, when I sent you that quote, you immediately responded with a picture.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we remember the so-called refutation of the sauropod dinosaur at Kachina Bridge within Natural Bridges National Monument, to which I responded with my refutation of the refutation.
Uh-huh.
And the interesting thing is that the so-called original refutation by the evolutionary community was by two individuals who hadn't actually even been up on the ledge. And I pointed out on my website, untoldsecretsofplanetearth.com, and my refutation of the refutation is still up there, that the creationists had been up on the ledge many, many times before. And that requires getting a ladder down there. And so just to demonstrate that this isn't really difficult, I hauled a ladder down there myself. And it took me less than 26 minutes from the top to get the ladder down. And I got up on the ledge and I examined the petroglyph from within inches away, which is really the only way to examine this thing, and demonstrated that the so-called scientific analysis that was done is just simply flat out wrong on a number of different points. One of the ideas was that this U-shape. Now, when you go back and you take a look at the interviews that were done before, originally the idea that was being put forth that it was a snake. Well, then the ideas changed, and it was no longer a snake, but the tail became a U shape that was no longer connected to the rest of the body. And so it's interesting how the evolutionary ideas evolved on what this was and what it was not. Mm-hmm. And so now the U shape was a completely separate entity from the body, and it was not connected to the body itself. Well, ironically, that's just totally outright false. And had they got actually up onto the ledge, and I challenged this individual, and I've already mentioned his name, so I'm not going to mention it twice. I'm not picking a fight on your show here, Ian. But the fact is that it is connected to the rest of the body, and my pictures demonstrated it, and even their low-resolution black and white images, if you look closely, demonstrate that it is connected. There is no difference in the peck pattern. There is no difference in the erosion of those peck patterns, the depth of the patterns, the size of the pattern. I mean, it's absolutely identical. It was made at the same time, the erosional features are identical, etc., etc.
Right.
And so then the idea was, well, the legs aren't really legs, they're just mud stains. And I went through all of the details of this and thoroughly refuted all of these things, talked about the different techniques that were used by the ancient Native American Indians, etc., etc., etc. The fact of the matter is that this is still powerful, positive evidence that the Native American Indians, the Anasazi Indians, had to have seen these creatures. Are there dinosaur bones there, Ian? Yes, there are bits and pieces of dinosaur bones. But as you well know, those bones are firmly anchored in very solid rock. There's no doubt that the Native American Indians of that region saw bits and pieces of bones, maybe picked them up, but to excavate an entire sauropod, as I explain in my book, Untold Secrets of Planet Earth, Dire Dragons, we're talking about a problem that nobody has been able to explain. It's taken 200 years to develop the techniques, to develop the tools, to develop the glues. And even if you get all the bones, now we're talking about anatomy and physiology knowledge in order to put those bones together correctly. We're talking about now soft tissues. And the interesting thing is, if people all over the world were digging up the bones, why do they almost never depict the bones? They depict these creatures in with the flesh on, in living positions, interacting with people. And that's exactly what you see at Kachina Bridge, is a creature that is in a living pose with the flesh on. And so all over the world we see this, not just at Kachina Bridge, but the creature at Kachina Bridge, without any question, beyond a reasonable doubt, is a sauropod dinosaur. Now, I've had people say, oh, but his neck is up in the air. And we know from our reconstructions of the fossils that sauropods held their necks out almost straight. And so when we have a posture like this, almost straight up, it's incorrect. They couldn't have possibly seen a dinosaur like that because it's completely incorrect. Well, here's what's interesting. In 2009, a gentleman by the name of Darren Naish challenged the secular paleontological community based on those reconstructions. And he said, you know what? You guys are wrong. Based on everything that we see living today, you guys are dealing with dead, dry bones. And if you take a look at the paper that Darren Naish wrote, he said there has to be a lot more flexibility than what you guys are talking about. And so he was looking at the tails, he was looking at the necks of creatures such as sauropods, and he is suggesting that there was a lot more flexibility than what they previously allowed. I believe it's 2009. Darren Naish is the name of the gentleman that did the paper, and he's done a lot of papers dealing with fossils, and he's basically saying you paleontologists don't do a really good job when you're trying to deal with dead, dry bones. And so he also did some other work dealing with fossils as well, such as the giant rabbit. And they reconstructed the rabbit with the neck basically straight out. And he said, why in the world would you think the neck would be straight out when living rabbits have their necks up like this? And so very interesting papers this guy's writing. Secular guy, secular communities, science guy. And so, you know, when we see artwork with the necks up, why do we have a problem with that?
Right, right.
And so anyway, that's just one example. And of course, there's examples all over the world. We can go into the Amazon rainforest, and again, we see another sauropod surrounded by 9 hunters. And this was the show we did. Actually, I think we did 2 shows on this, Ian. And of course, at the time, I'm not sure if we had finished the scientific analysis or not. Do you recall?
You had just finished the scientific analysis, but you had not yet published your latest book, which I still didn't get a copy.
Okay.
Amazon Expedition.
Amazon Expedition. And so I was mentioning Dr. Marvin Rowe and his technique called plasma oxidation, published in the scientific literature now for 20 years. And plasma oxidation was actually, because the skeptics raged, the pigments were too bright. At the end of the day, those pigments were tested with plasma oxidation, demonstrated to be authentic. Another sauropod with his neck fairly high up in the air, and here we have it again, sauropods surrounded by 9 hunters in the Amazon rainforest, and based on the testing of those pigments, we're talking about give or take 3,000 years ago.
Right.
So, I mean, how many pieces of artwork that have been proven to be authentic, you know, we're talking about petroglyphs and pictographs only right now because of the Black Dragon Canyon that turned out not to be a pterosaur. But it's not like it is the only petroglyph, pictograph, etc. that has been found. Now, there are many other pieces of artwork around the world that are carvings, that are tapestries, that are 3-dimensional, that are much, much more impressive than mere petroglyphs and pictographs. And some of those are in my book, and we're working on a 3rd edition. And it's exciting stuff, Ian. It's exciting for Bible-believing Christians, and I can just see about 500 thumbs down going to be on this video now because I said that. You know, and the atheists are going to get all worked up, and how can you possibly believe in the Bible and dinosaurs and people? That's ridiculous. Well, there's so much more evidence that we're getting ready to publish, so much more stuff, and it really seems incredible. It seems incredible because I was raised outside the church. I was raised to believe in anything but the Bible, but the more and more we get out there and the more and more real science that we do and the more and more we investigate this world, the more and more it actually blows my mind that I spent 19 years outside of the church mocking the Christians for having to go to the church and read and study that what I thought was a ridiculous book, a ridiculous religion, Christianity. How foolish can people really be? That's how I thought. You know, as I drove by in my friend's Pontiac Firebird playing AC/DC Hell's Bells, yes, that's what I did. And now I look back and I say, wow, was I ever missing out? The Bible is actually true. Wow. I was on the other side of the fence, Ian.
Mm-hmm.
And now the atheists are probably looking at me saying, man, look at that kook. That's okay. I don't mind. Because I was a guy on the other side of the fence looking at the Christians saying, man, those guys are kooks. It's okay. I don't mind. I'll make whatever you want. Makes no difference to me.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for sharing. And thanks so much for being on the season premiere of the show. I know the viewers... I know the viewers really look forward to this. I had a lot of comments the last 2 times you were on the show, so it's always good to have you on.
Good to be on, Ian.
You can get copies of the latest editions of the Untold Secrets of Planet Earth books from untoldsecretsofplanetearth.com, all one word. And while I haven't had the privilege of seeing the final Amazon Expedition book, I did have the privilege of seeing the final digital copies of the pages before it was sent to printing. All of them are typical, gorgeous books, great coffee table readers, and just a fun read, which will definitely provoke discussion about creation and evolution and the evidence for creation. This interview was edited for television, but you can catch the entire interview on our website, genesisweek.com. Stick around, we'll be back in 1 minute.